I learned to notice the small betrayals first, the way a toothbrush didn't sit right in its holder, the faint perfume at the collar of a shirt that belonged to someone else, the way his laugh would soften when his phone lit up at 2 in the morning. You'd think, looking back, that those little things were warnings written in invisible ink across the calendar of my life. I didn't read them. I wanted to believe Daniel. I wanted to be the woman who forgave. I wanted so badly, in those quiet, simple ways, to be enough. My name is Mary. I am 31, I work at a small design firm that smells of coffee and laser-cut plywood, and I loved Daniel like a compass loves the north. Reverently, without questioning its own existence. He was charismatic in a way that made people give him the last piece of cake and strangers tell him their secrets. He was a photographer, which suited him because he was always looking at the world through a slightly different angle. He had a laugh that could brighten the back of a dull room. He had a patience with my messy apartment and a kindness for stray cats. He also had a second life. I found out on a Thursday. I was supposed to be going out with him, and he said he was stuck at a shoot downtown. I told myself not to be angry. I told myself to trust. I cooked the kind of pasta he liked and left the bottle uncorked because he always drank too quickly when he was nervous. He'd texted a little after 9. I'm sorry, shoot ran late. Meet you at midnight? I rolled my eyes and stewed the sauce. At 11:59 I decided to brush my teeth. That's when I saw it. A smear of lipstick on the inside collar of the linen jacket he wore to our last friend's party. Not the cheap, bright lipstick Claire. I knew Claire. She was a lipstick type that screamed for attention. This was a muted, expensive thing that smelled of bergamot and lies. I touched it with my finger. It came away like an accusation. I waited. I told myself I'd be calm. When he walked in at 1:17 a.m., breathless and apologetic, my voice felt foreign to my own ears when I asked, "Was someone with you?" He hesitated in that way lovers do before they decide which truth will be easiest to explain. "It was nothing, Mary," he said. He meant it. He always thought nothing could be dangerous. So I learned to keep dangerous things close. Revenge doesn't begin with a plan. It begins with a quiet, private furnace that burns and reshapes you. For a week I was a woman people would describe as composed. I smiled at brunches. I answered emails. I played the part of being unruffled. Inside, I was cataloging dates, times, odd phrases. I installed nothing but I listened like a tape recorder. I found the woman's name. Claire Mercer. People at the gallery where Daniel worked mentioned Claire in that breathless, familiar way lovers use when they can't say anything but they can paint portraits with suggestion. Claire was luminous in the photographs Daniel showed at the gallery. Pale skin like porcelain, hair cropped into a bob that made her neck look defiant, eyes like windows with curtains half open. She had a laugh that left a stain on the photographs, too. I wanted to hate her in the way the movies tell you to hate the other woman. Instead I found myself curious. Curiosity is a dangerous door. The simplest of options felt too blunt. Confrontation would have been too clean, too theatrical. I didn't want to break him in a single scream. I wanted to erode him like water erodes stone. Slow, persistent, inevitable. I wanted him to see his own reflection and recognize the stranger he had become. First, I studied him as if he were a subject for one of his photographs. Daniel had habits. He left his keys in the same bowl, he placed his shoes at a particular angle, he debated music with a fervor that made him forget the time. I measured the soft spots in his armor. He liked being admired for his generosity. He liked being seen as a savior. He liked to believe he was better than his worst choices. So I fed those beliefs like a gardener pruning a vine. I let him see me as the forgiving one. I let him think I didn't know. The paradox of revenge is that patience is a weapon. He began to relax. He began to forget the little lies because they seemed to cost him nothing. He wrote me long notes about how he missed me when he was away, how he was inspired by some project. He asked me to come to the gallery opening for a series he promised would be different. I accepted. At the opening, Claire was there in person, not merely a ghost in a print. She stood near a collection of large, almost brutal photographs of abandoned places, Getty's factories and empty theaters, and laughed with other artists as if boredom had never touched her. Daniel moved through the room, smiling, proud. I watched him from across the crowd, crossing and recrossing the distance between us like a man circling a city he used to know. I made friends with Claire that night. Not the kind of friendship that blooms overnight, but the kind that tastes of calculated interest. I complimented her in small, exact ways. I mentioned a book she had on the table, a leaning volume about cinematography that I had read years ago. Her eyes lit in recognition. "You like Tarkovsky?" she asked. We spoke in phrases that turned into the kind of private language strangers invent when they sense an easy accord. Claire was not cruel. She was not the monstrous figure I'd been rehearsing in my head. She was tender and selfish, and complicated in ways that made her more human and therefore, to me, more dangerous. She told me in confidence about an upcoming show in Berlin, about projects she wanted to pursue, and about Daniel and the way lovers sometimes refer to a storm, awe and fear mixed together. She believed she was Daniel's future. He believed he could have both of us. That same night, when the crowd thinned and the gallery hummed like an animal settling in, I came up behind Daniel. I put my hands around his shoulders and hugged him like a woman who had forgiven everything. He leaned into me, surprised, and whispered the almost invulnerable words lovers say when they don't want to hurt anyone. "You're my home." He had no idea that my plan was an archaeology of the self he took for granted. Over the next 2 months I lived 2 lives. The ordinary life where I went to work, bought oranges at the market, fed hunks of torn bread to the cat under the stoop, and the other life where I wove suggestions into the world like seeds. I told Claire about a photography residency in Prague that would be perfect for her. I told Daniel about an opportunity at a creative magazine that, coincidentally, needed a portfolio like his. I told each what they wanted to hear. There is a cruelty in being patient with people who do not deserve it. The cruelty is that you teach them to be comfortable. They expand into that comfort like mold. I started small. I attended Daniel's shoots, took buy-in on his schemes with a smile, and slowly, his audience of friends and colleagues began to blur. He introduced me as his partner, and he introduced Claire as an upcoming artist, separating us by syllables. Claire began to post photographs of Daniel on her feed. Close, romantic portraits that hinted at something private. People liked them and wrote comments like, "So beautiful," and "You too." Daniel basked. One night, after a glass of red wine, Claire kissed Daniel in front of me. I remember the exact taste of my wine. Oaky warm, and the feeling that something inside of me had been put under a scanner. I left the apartment and walked. The city at midnight was indifferent and honest. It did not pretend that it was anything except itself. I sat at a bench by the river and thought of the things I could do in a rage. I thought of fire and of knives the size of promises. Then I laughed quietly because the simplest thing in the world was to be the person I used to be. I liked subtlety better than spectacle. So I became subtle. I wrote notes in careful, reasonable tones. I organized dinners where Daniel would be seen making a small but cruel faux pas, a joke that misfired, a comment about art that landed as self-satisfaction. I fed stories to friends about him being distracted and brilliant but unreliable. I signed him up for small humiliations that aggregated. Hurt people heal. Broken reputations can be rebuilt, but a ruined image of yourself to your peers is a particular kind of cold. I will not pretend there were not nights I wanted to burn everything to the ground. I will not pretend the thought of bodily harm never crossed my mind in those dark hours. It did. But violence is sloppy and fleeting, and I wanted an elegy for his choices that would echo. The real turn came when I realized he loved not only the thrill of being desired but also the story he could tell about being the righteous rescuer. Daniel liked to be the man who saw the people nobody else noticed. He loved the edges of others' lives because they made him feel central. I would take that away by making those edges mirror back to him in the most intimate way. I would become the woman who was wounded and healed, publicly radiant, and he would be the one whose hands trembled. I started with Daniel's work. He was due to submit a portfolio to a prestigious magazine. He showed me the prints first, like a child who wanted approval. They were fine, competent, intimate, but there was a sameness to them that I could identify because I have an eye for detail. I made small suggestions, maybe vary the lighting, maybe a different sequencing. He smiled indulgently and made the changes I recommended. He trusted me because he thought I loved him. I, in turn, praised Claire's work loudly. I slid copies of her prints to a few of my friends who wrote for the magazine, and to the curator who had once been indifferent to Daniel. I whispered soft truths. Claire's work has urgency. Daniel's is lovely, but Claire has something raw. People nodded. They exchanged messages. A different set of eyes fell upon their lives. When the magazine called with interest, it was Claire's name on their lips. Daniel fumed privately. He called me afterwards, voice tight, and asked how I could have helped someone else get an opportunity he deserved. I answered with a tone that felt like sunlight. I'm proud of Claire. She deserves it. The voice I used was a scalpel, so thinly veiled as to be indistinguishable from ordinary decency. It worked. Claire left for Berlin with a fellowship and a new string of connections. Daniel stayed behind, writing long emails about being betrayed by the currents of the art world. He became a little bitter, and with bitterness comes a kind of incompetence. He started missing bookings. He was late for shows. The apology notes grew longer. People began to notice the pattern: brilliance, exhaustion, flaking out. His fans loved him less for being unpredictable and more for being unreliable. Then the more delicate part. I knew his friends. I knew the routes he traveled through other people's hearts. I invited them, one by one, for coffee, to my small kitchen with its chipped enamel sink, and I let them see me as the one who hurt and yet remembered how to laugh. I told them things, not lies, never lies, but framed details that created a narrative in which Daniel's restlessness looked like arrogance, his charisma looked like manipulation. Social perception is a paper town. The people inside it will fold at the slightest pressure. There were other moves, smaller and meaner, that were morally ambiguous. I told his ex, Cass, about Claire, not to create allegiances but to let the old wounds reopen. Cass, who had once learned what it felt like to be replaced, reached out to mutual friends and planted a seed of doubt. The seed grew. People started to say, "He can be careless," and later, "He should have known better." Words accumulate like currency. Reputation is wealth. Daniel noticed the change. Where he had once ridden a tide of admiration, he began to be navigated by whispers. He called me frantic in the early mornings, asking if I had heard anything. Sometimes the panic sounded like a child inside a man. I would hold the phone like a relic and speak softly. "I know. I'm here. I should admit something here." This was not purely revenge for the sex, for the betrayal. It became, more and more, a project about control. I had been disarmed and catalogued with a single smear of lipstick. I wanted to be the curator of a new narrative where I could define him. I became so good at it that I sometimes surprised myself at how easily I could bend the angles of perception. There is a particularly ugly thing I did that I have to own. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, lived an hour away in a small town and depended on him for odd errands and letters of comfort. I called her one afternoon, voice steady, and told her that Daniel had been, in small ways, unreliable. Forgotten visits, missed calls. I did not say he had cheated. I said he had been distant, and I let the idea bloom into disappointment. Mothers are more brutal judges than strangers. They see someone's private cracks and measure them against the child they still see. Eleanor's calls to Daniel increased. Her disappointment made him scramble. He told me later, voice raw, that his mother had told him she was worried. He said it like a man who had never had to fight a mother's disappointment. My revenge was a patient weeding of his life. But I also wanted a public falling. Something embodied. A moment where all the people who had watched us would see who we'd both become. The opportune moment presented itself at one of those charity galas. The kind with name tags on silver trays and speeches that always ran too long. Daniel had been asked to speak about his work and community outreach. He practiced. He wanted the applause back. I went, of course. I wore an old dress that fit me like a memory. I listened to the hall buzz and chewed the inside of my cheek until it tasted like iron. Daniel's words were generous and safe, about the value of art and empathy. He looked around the room and sought faces he wanted to impress. Then he introduced Claire as his collaborator. A harmless, proud gesture. The crowd owed him kindness, and they gave it. I had scheduled my own private reveal carefully. Earlier that week, I had sent a small packet of photos to the magazine's editor under a different name, Mary Lewis, suggesting that someone in Daniel's personal life might have access to private images that contradicted the public narrative of his charitable innocence. The packet showed nothing graphic. It showed Daniel in moments that, if seen without context, made him appear opportunistic. Daniel laughing with the CEO of a development firm while a community project he cited as collaboration stood half complete, staff unpaid. Another picture showed him accepting a framed certificate for community work while his phone flashed with messages from photographers desperate to be paid for hours he had promised to them. Those images were photographs of truth and omission together. They were not slander because they were not lies. They were, instead, a reframing. The magazine printed an editorial note that week about accountability in the arts, and used the photographs to demonstrate how appearances could mislead. People read it, and they began to talk. At the gala, when the applause for Daniel ebbed and someone mentioned the editorial, a ripple moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Words passed ears, and ears passed them again. People looked at Daniel with new measurement. The moment of humiliation wasn't loud. It was like a stage light switched to show the dust. He faltered. I watched him from across the room, and for the first time since the lipstick, I saw panic. He found me after the speech, hands shaking, cheeks wet with something he had not intended to show. "Mary," he said, and it was a plea. "You should have told me," I said, and the voice I used was smaller than the manner in which I felt it. He clung to me then, like someone who has fallen and is learning how to let go of the thing that will cushion them. He began to make mistakes after that. Poor decisions made under the pressure of being watched. He lashed out at friends who offered help. He cancelled commitments that had been months in the making. His work suffered, then his clients, then his friends. Claire called him once, voice trembling, and asked him whether he had been honest with the people he worked with. He lied to her. He said yes. She left for Berlin earlier than planned. After Claire left, the house felt huge. The nights were anemically long. I would wake and stare at the clock and feel my heart orbiting some foreign planet. I had won, in a manner of speaking. He was no longer the man who could be adored indiscriminately. People whispered. The gallery that had once backed him put their money elsewhere. Invitations thinned. "Why are you doing this?" he asked me one night when he had come back after too many drinks. He was more translucent than he used to be, like paper dipped in rain. "You could have stayed. We could have fixed it." "Was that what you wanted to fix, Daniel?" I asked. "Or did you want the freedom to keep being who you were?" He fell silent, and in that silence was the thing I had been trying to make him feel. The knowledge that the story he had told himself, that he could be both the devoted lover and the charmer who slid between other lives, was a fantasy. People loved simple stories. His life had been a complex novel with too many points of view. People were bored of the author. But triumph tastes complicated. The victory I carved was not clean. Even as I watched him unravel in public, I felt the old sorrow, the small and constant ache for the man I had loved when his flaws were only small and forgivable. Revenge had taught me cunning, but it hadn't taught me to love less. In fact, it taught me to love in a different register. More closed, less trusting, more lucid. It made me into someone who could orchestrate outcomes without being destroyed by them. When the dust settled, Daniel tried. He tried to apologize in ways that were clumsy and half-hearted and therefore honest. He offered to sell his camera and donate the money to the community projects he had misused in order to repair himself. He tried therapy. Sometimes he would look at me across a cafe table like a man who had found a map to a place he'd once lived and could no longer find. I accepted apologies in a certain way, like one accepts a returned book. I listened, and then I nodded, and I set the book back on a higher shelf. I did not break him. I had no desire to become someone who lived to haunt. Instead, I wanted to stand in a sunlight of my own choosing. There is a final piece to the revenge I carried out that feels, even now, like a small mercy. After months of watching him shrivel under scrutiny, after I had seen careers stall and friendships flay, I wrote a long letter to Daniel. I did not mail it. I did not need to. I wanted it to exist in a place where it could be read in silence. In the letter I told him everything. About the lipstick, about the nights I had walked by the river, about the dinners I had staged and the friends I had softened with gratitude toward me. I told him the truth of my calculations, the shame of them, and something like this: that vengeance, when consumed, leaves a residue. He read the letter because he found it on the kitchen table the morning I left. He read it like a man who has discovered his own biography in someone else's handwriting. He called me later, voice small, and asked if I had been happy. I said simply, "I am freer." "What does that mean?" he asked, and his voice cracked like dry paper. "It means," I told him, "that I cannot be eroded further. I am not the same woman who accepted a second life as a quiet thing. I am the woman who keeps her edges." He didn't come back. He tried for a while, to rebuild with clumsy philanthropies and travel and apologies that landed like paper planes. He found a way to be smaller in public and perhaps, kinder privately. The art world moved on. New men took his place. New women arrived with their own lipstick and their own storms. As for me, a few months later I got an offer to lead a small curation project at the community center that had once been a staging ground for Daniel's good intentions. I accepted. The work was humble and real. organizing exhibits for teenagers who had never seen their neighborhood celebrated. I taught them to frame light and shadow. They listened to my stories about how a photograph can be the truth and also a lie. There is, I think, something important to say here about justice. I did not break Daniel to enjoy the sound. I tried, in my own imperfect fashion, to make consequences mirror the choices he had made. I wanted him to see himself reflected clearly. He learned humility. He also learned how to be alone in a way that might have been kinder for both of us. Perhaps that is cruelty dressed as pedagogy. Perhaps it is survival. On the day the show opened at the community center, Daniel sent a single message: "I'm proud of you." It was a small thing. I could have ignored it. I did not. I answered simply, "I know." When you survive a betrayal, people tell you to move on, as if motion will heal everything. But moving on implies a linearity I have never experienced. Instead, you resculpt your life around the absence. You learn to place new objects where empty things used to be. You teach yourself that forgiveness is not a surrender but an architecture. You build a life with rooms meant for the people you choose to keep and doors for the rest. I achieved revenge in the end. It was not the explosive, cinematic collapse I had once dreamed of during sleepless nights. It was quieter, more precise, and it cost me pieces of myself I had to reclaim. I won by outlasting him in the simplest way possible, by refusing to be the woman who allowed herself to be softened into invisibility. I won by choosing the light of small, stubborn projects over the bright, easy temptation to burn everything to the ground. Sometimes, when I wake in the mornings and the cat kneads my stomach with its tiny paws, I think of what might have happened if I had confronted him that first night. Would I have felt better? Perhaps. But there is a particular clarity that comes with strategy, with the knowledge that you can shape the narrative of your life rather than be shaped by it. That clarity tastes like cold coffee and fresh paper and the slow satisfaction of a photograph developed in the dark. If you ask me now whether I regret what I did, I would tell you the truth. I regret the parts of me that learned to measure love by consequences. I regret the nights when the hunger for justice made me cruel. I do not regret the decision to not let infidelity become the defining story of my life. Sometimes survival requires a sort of artistry, and mine was messy and human. Mary, the woman who loved, who planned, who hurt, and who was hurt, learned to be something else entirely. Not only a victor or a victim, but an editor of her own fate. I rearranged the pages of my story until the sentence I lived in felt honest enough to keep. And when the city smells of new rain and the light slants in a certain way across the sidewalks, I walk past the gallery where he still sometimes shows his work. I look in the window, not with anger, but with the small guarded affection of someone who once loved and has chosen now to keep loving on different terms. There is an odd peace in that. It tastes like bergamot, the scent that once betrayed him. I still put my lips to a cup of tea and close my eyes sometimes, and I think, the world is large and people are complicated, and we are all, in some measure, learning how to be kinder versions of ourselves. But if we cannot be kind, at least we can be honest with the ways we choose to fight back. I left the kitchen with the letter on the table and the apartment smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and old coffee. Daniel read it. He called. He did not come back. That felt like an ending, but endings are deceptive. They are simply chapters closing while other chapters inhale. 4 weeks after, I measured the rooms the way you check the fit of clothes after weight loss, with an approving, cautious hand. The community center show was a kind of salve. Teenagers with nervous hands and proud eyes rearranged their own lives in little frames, and I learned, again and again, the particular miracle of a young person seeing themselves in art for the first time. I was good at this, at turning small things into proof. It steadied me. But the world is stubbornly repeatable. One damp October afternoon, a photograph arrived in a package with no return address. A candid, taken from the street, of me leaving the community center. I recognized the angle, the way the light caught the seam of my coat, the tilt of my head. It was a photograph Daniel used to take when he wanted to claim ownership of a moment. My first thought was that somebody was playing a tired game. My second thought, quicker, was that the game had teeth. I put the print on the work table and watched it as if it were an animal I had once named. The cat batted at the edge of the paper and then lost interest, which is to say the world did not rotate around my anxieties. I called no one. I folded it carefully and put it inside the top drawer with the rest of my notes, the small ledger of moves, the lists of people and dates and what had worked. I had kept them because I am an archivist of my own suffering. A week later, a message lit up my phone, an email address I did not know, one line in the body. He thinks you left too soon. D. My fingers trembled, which surprised me since I had once been steady enough to orchestrate humiliation on a public scale. Daniel's intrusion felt less like a threat and more like a question posed to me in a language I had not expected to understand. Was I still the woman who could be unmade? Or had I already built the walls necessary to keep the tide out? I could have taken a simpler route. I could have threatened, sued, called the police for harassment. But I knew Daniel. He loved theater and irony, and he would relish the role of the persecuted artist. He would frame any legal proceeding as yet another cautionary tale about power and silence. I did not want a legal logic or moral lectures. I wanted a finality that did not reopen the public wounds. I wanted him to stop because he no longer saw me as a target but as something inscrutable. So I wrote back. Not a letter of hailstorm threats, not a thin apology. I wrote a short note. I'm not who you think I am anymore. If you want something, say so. If you want to hurt, you'll need to find a new instrument. His reply was immediate, as if he had been waiting at a window. I expected bitterness, an offer of mutual destruction. Instead, his message was unexpectedly bureaucratic, impatient. We need to talk. Coffee. Tomorrow. Noon. D. We met in a cafe halfway between his former gallery and the community center, a neutral island with yellow cups and chipped saucers. He wore a coat that had seen better winters. He looked like someone practicing humility. For a heartbeat I was tempted to let him, to soften and reply with the old script. But the old script had been what made me vulnerable in the first place. He sat opposite me, eyes searching a map only he could read. He tried to joke about small things at first, the weather, a mutual friend who had moved cities, but jokes were like papier-mâché attempts at diplomacy. When he finally looked at me, there was a thinness to his voice I recognized, the voice of someone who had been stripped down by consequences. I never meant for you to hurt like you did, he said, the sentence falling out of him like a coin. Meaning isn't always permission, I answered. You built a life where you could choose between versions of truth. That's what I needed to dismantle. His eyes flicked to the side, and then he took a breath that resembled repentance. He told me about Berlin and the work he'd left undone, about exhibition contracts he'd botched because he'd been distracted, and about money he'd misplaced. He said it without the old theatrical flourish. His voice was quieter, older in a way. He said he'd tried to be better and kept making the same mistakes. He sounded tired of repeating the same confession. I listened. I measured every tilt of his head like an exposure in a photograph. There was a moment while he spoke, when the old tenderness in me, the dangerous old tenderness that once softened my spine, reached out like a hand that could not help itself. I swallowed it. Something in me had been educated by the costs of mercy. I had read the ledger of my own pain. I had catalogued the ruin that often follows easy forgiveness. Do you want forgiveness? I asked. He hesitated. I want to be seen, he said finally. I want to be understood. You are seen, Daniel, I said. Seen for what you are. It was not cruel. It was taught with truth. He asked then, almost out of habit, if there was a chance, if we could rebuild. I watched the way his hands curled around the cup, as if cupping warmth might bring back entire seasons. For a sliver of a second I considered what rebuilding might look like, co-parenting a grief that wasn't ours yet, practicing honesty like a muscle. But the person who had loved him and tolerated the erasure of herself had been transformed. She had learned that rebuilding together often lets one person keep building while the other keeps erasing. So I said what I had to say. I won't be the person who absorbs your choices anymore. I can let you be small, and you can let me be necessary to myself. It was a sentence without poetry. It was clean. It was final. He left the cafe with something like a nod, a folded remorse. And for a while, at least, the photographs stopped arriving. Time passed in its lazy Greek way. Summer thinned to late sunlight, then to the clear, brittle air of the first cold weeks. The community center's new shows held on. Teens learned to place the horizon not in the middle but where it mattered to a story. I taught them more than photography. I taught them how to witness and, more importantly, how to record witness without letting their work be stolen for someone else's narrative. Yet the human brain, that hungry contraption, constructs stories from scraps. Sometimes, late at night, I would imagine Daniel in small apartments, piecing his life back like something that had been dropped. Adhesive, careful. Sometimes I would imagine him carving out a private truth that did not need to be defended with public performance. And then one day, months later, A small letter arrived from Daniel's mother, Eleanor. It was a short message with no edge to it, a photograph tucked inside of him and me from a distant summer, a memory perhaps stolen from a previous life where we had not yet become enemies and teachers. Eleanor's words were simple. He went away for a while. He writes letters to no one, but he asked me to tell you he hopes you are well. I folded the note and held the picture long enough to feel the warmth of the summer sun across my hands like a bruise. He had chosen exile, or solitude, or some rough penance. I felt neither triumph nor relief. I felt an odd, quiet mercy. There is a particular kind of victory that is not loud. It smells like clean paper and the first cup of coffee in a new kitchen. It is the feeling of waking up and not being defined by the way someone else saw fit to use you. It is the small, steady work of returning to yourself. I met someone once, not long after the show at the community center. He was not a savior or a project. He was a man with a careful laugh and steady hands who made quieter mistakes than Daniel and was ashamed of them when he noticed. We moved slowly, like two people learning a new language. He asked me about the past sometimes, and I told him things without drama. He listened. He did not rescue. He offered a kind of companionship that required no cost. Does that mean I forgave Daniel, fully? No. Forgiveness is not a currency I give freely. It is a frame I sometimes apply to myself so that the weight of what I did and what was done to me does not crush me. I forgave in part by choosing not to keep him as a frame around my future. I forgave in part by letting him be small in his way and by choosing to be large in mine. Months later, at another opening, a quiet, neighborhood affair, I saw him across a modest room. He had aged in ways that photographs could not fully capture. A softness at the edges, a wary politeness that was new. He caught my eye and lifted his cup in something like salute. I lifted mine back. "Proud of you," he mouthed silently, as if constrained by some new etiquette. I remembered his final message. "I'm proud of you." Then I thought of the boy who had once made me laugh with small absurdities. I thought of the man who had stitched together a life from public applause and private betrayals. I thought of the woman who had learned to orchestrate ruin and then to stop. I smiled, and for once it was uncomplicated. The victory I had sought had not been spectacle. It had been a rearrangement of the furniture in the house of my life. I had moved the chairs where they suited me. I had kept a room open for someone who saw me without making me their lesson. I had closed the door on someone who could not respect the architecture of who I was. When I walk now, the city feels less like a place of traps and more like a place of careful choices. I keep the portfolio of moves in the top drawer, still folded, not as a map to return to but as a reminder that I had the courage to interrupt a narrative. Once in a while I take the photograph of the street where I had first begun to suspect, and I look at it like a scientist looking at the first slide she examined under a microscope. The image is still true. It still holds what it holds. That is its power. Mary is not a novel hero. She is a woman who learned, by guile and cost, to be unassailable in the ways that truly matter. In the steadiness of her work, in the clarity of her choices, and in the softness she now allows herself, a guarded softness built on hard lessons. Revenge had been her teacher. Freedom was the lesson she finally enrolled in.